Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Andrew Wilson, Executive Director here at the Center for International Private Enterprise, and I'd like to welcome you to today's event on the state of the private sector in China. At CIPE, we believe that the private sector plays a crucial role in sustainable and inclusive growth. Our approach is to empower the private sector through business associations, chambers of commerce, think tanks, and universities to advocate for and enable competitive and free markets. For many years, our projects in China followed this model, supporting the growth of market institutions with an emphasis on corporate governance, economic reform, and support for independent industrial associations to boost local development. In more recent years, CIPE's programs have focused more on understanding the changing business environment in the country. And as Chinese investments in the activities of Chinese companies have become increasingly important outside the country, we're also tracking the economic footprint of Chinese investments and monitoring their impact on recipient countries, as well as the changing business behaviors of Chinese companies abroad. Many of you who follow the news in China have observed the growing presence of the party state in the decision-making and operations of firms across the private sector. Recently, the Communist Party has targeted technology companies, including the forced restructuring of Alibaba's Ant Financial, crackdowns on the gaming and online education sectors, and the explicit discouragement of stock listings on Western exchanges. One clear pattern with these new headlines is that the Chinese private sector is facing increasing political pressure to conform to party political demands. The increasing push for strong party committees and organizations in both state and private enterprises has gained steam, with nearly 50% of private companies hosting a party organization in 2018, including 462 out of the top 500 companies in China in 2019. Over the past decade, we've seen the growing influence of the party state within the private sector, including what are called special management shares for the government, which create greater voting rights than ordinary shares. This raises the natural question of how much control the party state must have over a firm before it stops being considered private. While it is true that all firms are subject to policy changes and regulatory intervention, the distinction between private and state firms have increasingly become blurred over the past decade. Today, China has leveraged vast industrial investment from abroad to become a center of world manufacturing, while limiting foreign company involvement within its borders through forced IP transfers, thus creating an environment in which Chinese companies can secure controlling domestic market share without foreign competition. And after several decades under a going out policy and the Belt and Road Initiative, Chinese companies today have drawn upon this combination of foreign investment, a protected domestic market, and government subsidies to become more connected, globalized, and influential. The expansion of BRI infrastructure projects across the developing world allows Chinese firms to be dominant players in various sectors that are key to China's industrial policies. For instance, Chinese corporate investments abroad have secured the country a near monopoly on cobalt, nickel, and other rare earth minerals, which are critical to high-tech industries, including chip manufacturing and rechargeable batteries. Chinese firms are also increasingly globally relevant in strategic industries and emerging technologies, from ByteDance and TikTok to green energy with solar photovoltaics. Chinese technology companies now seek to turn Chinese standards into international standards for emerging technologies like 5G internet and artificial intelligence, with implications for human rights. In short, both the Chinese government and corporations aim to promote their digital infrastructure and domestic rules globally, which raises concerns about the role these values will play in our digital future. Do we want a digitized world that respects privacy and the basic principles of human rights and democracy? Or do we want a proliferation of digital infrastructure that comes with the expansion and normalization of state surveillance? This has created a new front for debates pitting different value systems and fundamental differences on the respect of human dignity and a rules-based economy. Nowhere is this conflict clearer than in the treatment of the Chinese private sector domestically. As CIPE has recently published in our series, The Perils of State Capitalism, Chinese entrepreneurs are increasingly illegitimately charged and imprisoned by the state for their political views or their offenses to the politically connected. This year, more than ever, running a private enterprise in China is a risky business, with attacks on entrepreneurs becoming a constant theme. As we witness economic coercion against countries including Australia and Lithuania from perceived opposition to the Chinese government's interests, we can see how the state's domestic policies foreshadow what the party may attempt beyond its borders. To that end, I'm looking forward to learning more about the situation facing Chinese business from our panel today. And it is now my pleasure to hand this event over to Catherine Tai, our CIPE Deputy Regional Director for Asia, who's going to moderate our discussion. Kathy, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew, for the great opening remarks, which really laid out the foundations of the discussion today, and also clearly pointed out many examples that are clear signs of that the party now is rethinking its relationship with the private sector. And the system and the nature of the relationship between the state and the private sector has changed so dramatically the past decade. So the state obviously is and has decided to rein in the private sector, as many examples that Andrew pointed out. And today's discussion is a very timely one, because it's time to spend thorough discussion to examine these changing dynamics in China, as these changing dynamics will have direct impact on China's economy, its private sector, and has huge implications for the rest of the world. And today is my great pleasure to moderate a panel of distinguished speakers to discuss what happened in China, what it meant for entrepreneurs in China and foreign investors, as well as Chinese economy and global economy. So some housekeeping rules first. We will begin with about 6 to 7 minute presentation from each of the panelists, followed by questions that I prepared. And then we will have about 15 minutes with the audience. So for all the attendees, please feel free to use the Zoom chat box to send in your questions. And then we definitely will do our best to answer all of them. Please also note that this session is being recorded and currently is live streamed on Facebook. The recorded video will be shared by YouTube after today's event. So now let me introduce the panelists in the order of their presentations. First, I would love to introduce Professor Yasheng Huang. Professor Yasheng Huang is the APAC Foundation Professor of International Management and Faculty Director of Action Learning at the MIT Sloan School of Management. His previous appointments include faculty positions at the University of Michigan and at Harvard Business School. Professor Huang is currently involved in a research project in 4 broad areas. First, a book project titled The Nature of the Chinese State. The second one is he's working on creating a complete database on historical technological inventions in China, which is a collaboration with Tsinghua University. Third, a project on food safety in China. Last but not least, a research on venture finance, production of scientific knowledge, work of future in China. He has published numerous articles in academic journals and in media and 11 books in Chinese and English. The second panelist is David Barboza, founder of The Wire, a must-read digital news magazine on China's economic rise. David won a Pulitzer in 2013 for his work on coverage of billions of dollars of wealth that owned by relatives of then Prime Minister Wen Jiabao. David has interviewed many prominent people, scholars, researchers, and most recently including Desmond Shum, a former confidant of Premier Wen Jiabao's wife and author of Red Roulette. So feel free to check out the Wire website for more information. Now let me turn the stage to Professor Huang, and so for his initial opening remarks.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Andrew, for organizing this event and inviting me to speak about this very important topic. It is very interesting to frame the current crackdown on Chinese private sector historically, rather than just sort of framing it as a singular event. If you go back to 2012, as soon as Xi Jinping assumed power, he gave a speech about why the Soviet Union collapsed. And in the speech, he argued that the Soviet Union collapsed because the country didn't have ideological coherence, ideological homogeneity, and that's why the country collapsed. Okay, so that's one hypothesis, but there could be other hypotheses that I would argue match better with what actually happened. Soviet Union collapsed because its economic growth was stagnant. It didn't have any economic growth. And the country didn't have a powerful, vibrant private sector. The country had no productivity growth. It's all coming from investment, and initially coming from labor participation, but then Soviet Union experienced a demographic stagnation in the 1970s. You know, at least these are parallel explanations that are as plausible as the one about ideological homogeneity, ideological coherence. Why this is important? It is important in the following sense. It is the private sector that saved the Chinese Communist Party. Right? It saved the Chinese Communist Party in the 1980s by growing rapidly, first in rural China, creating millions of jobs, employment opportunities, income improvement. And then in the 1990s, it was foreign direct investment, it was privatization and large corporate development. And then in the 2000s, private sector was a very important part of the infrastructure building of the country. Along with it, there was a lot of corruption, no question, but we can go into that. It was a lot of crony capitalism, and the quality of the system was problematic. And then look at what happened in 2020 after the outbreak of the COVID-19 in Wuhan. Who came up with a health code that helped the government deal with three types of people: infected, people who are not infected, and people in between. That preserves some mobility of population and prevented the economy from collapsing further due to the lockdown and other containment measures implemented as a result of COVID-19. Who developed those health codes? It was Alibaba and Tencent. Right? Let's look at the employment creation. 80% of the employment was created in the private sector. Let's look at the tax revenue. Let's look at the sources of productivity growth. All these economic benefits are enjoyed by the Chinese population and Chinese society, but they're also enjoyed by the ruling party. And the ruling party is able to reap the tax benefits, the productivity benefits, and the innovation benefits from a growing and strong private sector. In the past 2 years, there have been a number of reports about the Chinese technological development. And these reports, you know, there is one by commissioned by Eric Schmidt. Harvard Kennedy School recently put out a report essentially listing a number of sectors where China is either ahead or comparable or close behind the United States. And I think those reports are very worth reading because they do tell us about the state of the technological development in China today. But it is important to go behind the headline findings of the report and ask the question, how did these technological developments come about? They came about because of collaborations with foreign scientists, because of collaborations of scientists between the United States, between scientists of Europe, Japan, and Chinese scientists. It came about because so many Chinese students have been educated abroad in the United States primarily. Also, it came about because of the private capital that went to fund many of these high-tech startups. In the biological science, the leading biotech firms were all funded by returnees from the United States and maybe from Europe as well. The ones I know of are funded by returnees from the United States, right? So if you look at the mechanisms of Chinese technological development, if you look at the mechanisms of Chinese economic growth, the answers are not that different from the kind of economic growth that we see elsewhere in the world. It comes from collaborations, it comes from foreign participations, it comes from private sector growth. And within those headlines, we can have a nuanced discussion about the role of the state in terms of organizing the finance, in terms of organizing the infrastructure. But the headlines are pretty straightforward. It is because China has reformed, not because China has had ideological coherence and homogeneity. So I would argue that the crackdown on the private sector is not only harmful to the economic growth, undermining the incentives, undermining the productivity contributions of the private sector. It also undermines stability of the country, right? I mean, now after the crackdown, to be fair to the Chinese government, they have softened their position a little bit. The issue is whether or not you can walk back all the way. They have to worry about employment issues now. Cutting off ties with foreign countries is going to be very costly to them. It is going to undermine some of the success factors that they have relied on to generate. Let's look at Huawei. Huawei has 120 foreign suppliers. It is a classic example of a collaborative technological development, right? When you cut off all these links and ties, you are also undermining technological development of the country. You are undermining the tax base. You are undermining the employment creation. How can one make a coherent argument that this is actually good for the Chinese Communist Party? I cannot think of one coherent argument that will be able to make that point. The only one argument I can think of is the private sector may challenge the Communist Party. So far, we have zero evidence that the Chinese private sector, Jack Ma and people like that, are challenging the Chinese Communist Party. By the way, Jack Ma, to the surprise maybe to some of the people in the audience, is a card-carrying Communist Party member. After Trump was elected, he flew to America because Trump was threatening to impose tariffs on China. He flew to America, tried to persuade Trump, don't do that. If you don't do that, I'm going to create 5 million jobs in America. I mean, he was obviously saying nonsense, but at least he was trying to repair the relationship between China and the United States. Gave me one piece of evidence that the Chinese private sector, even people like Jack Ma, is threatening the stability of the country, is threatening the monopoly rule of the Communist Party. What has changed is the tolerance for a little bit of space, ideological space, idea space. Now that space simply does not exist anymore. The notional existence of private sector outside of the state, that is viewed as a threat, right? The fact that Jack Ma flew to America to repair relationship between China and the United States by himself, that's viewed as a threat, right? So it is very frustrating sometimes to read in the news media and by some scholars. Whenever they see a crackdown on the private sector, then they automatically believe, oh, there must be a good reason for that. It must be because the Chinese private sector is threatening the control of the CCP. Show me one single piece of evidence that they have done that. I don't think they can, right? So I would argue that the crackdown is not only bad for the economy, it's actually bad for the politics as well. So I don't really see any upside. And it will be interesting to explore with David, with Kathy, exactly what motivated these actions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Huang. I think you describe a scenario that China is shooting itself in the foot very well, which by undermining economic growth, by cracking down the private sector, it actually is weakening its legitimacy to rule the country, because that has basically be the only legitimate reason for China to keep power. So thank you so much for describing the situation with us. We are going to discuss a little bit more on the China model and also like the growth model in China a little bit later at the panel discussion. And so now I want to turn the floor to David.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you, Kathy. So I want to just color in a little of what Professor Huang said, which I largely agree with. I mean, it's to summarize a little, when I got to China, in 2004, the real story was whether China could move up the value chain, whether it would just be a workshop of the world, whether they had the possibility of creating innovation companies and value-added services. And over time, you actually saw this remarkable transformation. And I think basically one of the things that Professor Huang was saying is they're really, the crackdown on the private sector is hitting at one of the great strengths of China, this remarkable turnaround. The fact that you could have companies like ByteDance challenging Facebook, or that you could have all the hottest biotech startups coming out of China, which was supposedly copying everything for so long. So it's clear that that was the driving strength. That was, the surprising thing to me after I left China in 2015 was that all of a sudden, a lot of those things that China has been, trying to improve on, private entrepreneurship, bringing in foreign capital, developing its own brands and things, that seemed to be working pretty well, increasingly well, by this combination of foreign capital and know-how, but also bringing as he said, bringing the Chinese students back, letting them do startups, creating a system where there's lots of investment flowing into great ideas. So what we've seen in the last couple of years is slowly the Chinese government seeming to undermine that for various reasons, which we can talk about. Undermining some of the entrepreneurship, tightening the controls over technology companies or startups. And also, I think a big part of this is reacting to what maybe that Beijing saw as the threat from the US of decoupling or of cutting off access to technologies. So I think when we think about what's happened in China, we might think, Part of it was internal, as Professor Huang alluded to, which is some sort of fear that the private sector was out of control and that it might even threaten the party. But I think the other part of it was that the Chinese government felt there's this, the supply chain is also a threat to us in China, that if the US can put sanctions on not only Huawei, but lots of other Chinese companies, we need to somehow develop all these technologies as soon as possible and maybe create national programs that help secure us. And maybe that's another reason that there is this crackdown, that they're going to reorient everything around the state. One thing that was left out of Professor Huang's talk, I think, is a lot of it is also, it's unclear because it seems that Xi Jinping's leadership is more about command and control in allegiance to the party. And maybe a lot of this is partly paranoia about the power of private entrepreneurs, and partly about the threat that maybe they are somehow behind the scenes, aiding the enemies of Xi Jinping or the leadership. Now, as he said, we don't see a lot of the evidence of that. But if you go back to, I think it was 2017, when Xiao Jianhua was detained or kidnapped from Hong Kong and brought back into China, he's still, all these years, 4 or 5 years later, still missing. I think that was a dramatic moment, that China would go after private entrepreneurs that maybe there was a sense that they are somehow interfering in, into politics and into the leadership circles. But soon, every year it seemed the crackdown got tighter, and inside China, it was slowly creeping up against any private entrepreneur who put their head out for various reasons. H&A or Wanda or Jack Ma and Ant Financial. All of a sudden we've seen, lots of tech entrepreneurs leave their companies or really go underground. And at the same time that this has happened internally in China, we've seen, because I think of not only the trade war between the US and China, but the US government's increasing tightness over sanctions and critiques of the Chinese system, a lot of entrepreneurs that I know don't want to be public or talk because they fear the US government might actually come after them. Because as you know, lots of this collaboration between the US and China in research, but also money is flowing back and forth, investment is flowing back and forth. Think of if you're a Chinese entrepreneur who studied in the US or may even be an American citizen who went back to China. Could you be seen as an agent for China by the US, or seen as an agent of the US by China? If you're caught in the middle of that, and I know a lot of people who are, it means you've tightened up as far as what should I invest in? Who should I partner with? Who should I do research with? So I think not only is this a Chinese government crackdown on private entrepreneurs for many various reasons that is kind of going to stifle a lot of the private entrepreneurs, but it's also an atmosphere internationally of fear that may change the dynamic of where money flows into China. Is it flowing from the US into a company that could be sensitive, a national security issue for the US or for China? So both the US and China see national security with listings, right? Are those Chinese companies going to list in the US? Or should they go back? Do we trust those Chinese companies and their financials? So I think this, if we're going to talk about private entrepreneurship or private enterprises, we should look at the full spectrum of what is happening to them. They're getting hit from every different angle. And that's going to affect not only what happens in China, but also what happens outside of China, with the flow of money, with the flow of ideas, with the what happens with universities and research. All of these things are going to change. And I think they're already changing. I think that is the bigger story. This is not just an internal Chinese entrepreneurs under fire. It's a bigger global story, and it has implications for every country that invests in China, partners with China, develops companies. And that's kind of where I'm thinking this conversation is going to have to go to think of it from the broadest way possible. But at the center is all of these entrepreneurs, which say 5 or 10 years ago, it looked like, wow, this is unbelievable. They are minting billionaires in China like crazy. There are more and more freedoms. They're creating more and more dynamic companies. And now all of a sudden, they're going into hiding. No one can say anything. Anything might be construed as against the state of China or getting involved in the US-China conflict. So do not give interviews to the media. Do not be public about what you're doing. And for whatever reason, the Chinese government may feel that you are somehow aiding the enemies of Xi Jinping, and you could be pulled down immediately. So we're seeing all sorts of dynamics go on. But I think at the center of it is this going to cripple China's efforts to transform the economy into an economy that can drive innovation with great companies? And I think that's the big question now, is whether they're not. You can use all the metaphors you want. Are they killing the golden goose or the goose that lays the golden egg? Are they crippling their best star companies? Is it such harsh regulatory reform that it scares off not only entrepreneurs but capital, foreign capital and Chinese capital? So I think I'll leave it there so that we can. I've thrown out so many things. We can discuss these issues.
This is just fascinating. Thank you, David, for the initial remarks. You touch upon many different issues that we can pick up a little bit later. So with that, I think I would love to move on to the panel discussion. First question goes to Professor Huang. So when we're talking about the private sector and when we're talking about entrepreneurship in China, maybe we go back a little bit, like in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s, when the Chinese economy really grew exponentially. And you've written 2 books, one on the capitalism with Chinese characteristic, that explained how China unleashed the economic potential of rural areas in the 80s. And you described it as a pro-private sector approach, which is very different one from a lot of people believed like Chinese economy is. And many around the world believe that China model is actually an alternative to market economy. Can you just elaborate a little bit on how China has successfully used the market and capitalism to benefit itself? And for many people around the world that aspire to adopt the China model, what will be your piece of advice to them?
Yeah, thank you, Kathy, for that question. Let me just say that my view is a minority view. And even among China academics who study China, they read my stuff, but then they will forget what I said. They will just continue with this view that Chinese economic growth is a result of this incredible smart government or Deng Xiaoping, it's a kind of a top level design reformer coming out and organize everything. And once I played this trick on an interlocutor who just told me that view, and I said, let me quote you something from someone who said that I have absolutely no clue why the rural economy took off. And I asked him, this economist, could you guess from what I said, who said that? He said, oh, this is obviously wrong. Of course, Deng Xiaoping, all these people, they opened up the Shenzhen, they opened up the rural economy. I said, actually, it's Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping said to the delegation from Yugoslavia in 1987 that rural China took off. He said, nobody within the Chinese Communist Party ever predicted that. We had no idea how it happened, what happened, and then it happened. That to me is the best summary of what happened in China, at least in the initial stage of economic development. It was by experimentations, it was bottom up, it was spontaneous, it was organic. Chinese Communist Party played a very important role, which was permitting licensing, not so much encouraging, but permitting licensing these developments without killing prematurely some of the experiments that actually at the beginning were problematic, but they had the foresight to tell themselves, let the experiment continue for a little bit and see what happened. That is the root of the Chinese economic success from day one. And since then, there are different other experimentations, and it's very interesting. In 1997, I was interviewing a Chinese government official in Shanghai. I said, could you introduce me to some private entrepreneurs? I want to interview them. I was teaching at Harvard Business School then, and then he looked at me in a very puzzled way. He said, as a Harvard professor, why are you interested in people who sell tea and watermelon on the street? It's a very interesting comment, because to him, private entrepreneurs, what can they do? They just sell tea and watermelons on the street. And I said, well, sir, with due respect, there are private enterprises with a name such as Microsoft, General Electric, and companies like that. So there's nothing in the gene of the private entrepreneurship that cannot, that would not be able to do more sophisticated stuff. And then I said, let me venture a hypothesis why they're selling tea and watermelon on the street in Shanghai. Because you don't allow them to go into these high-tech sectors. Alibaba, Jack Ma, he first tried to register his company in Shanghai, and he was rebuffed. And that's why he went back to Hangzhou. Hangzhou was more permissive. And this is the experimentation we're talking about. In different parts of the country, some regions have a more kind of state-controlled approach. Other regions have a more liberal approach. So the entrepreneurs can kind of arbitrage between these regions and then choose the best regions for their businesses. Jack Ma, Hangzhou was not his first choice. It was his second choice, right? The problem now in China is that because they never believed, sort of, as an academic researcher, I can say this is how it happened. That view has never become the official view, never the prevailing view, even on the part of liberal intellectuals, because they always talk about Deng Xiaoping, and without talking about the some of these experimental reforms that came as a result of Deng Xiaoping not dictating these reforms, but as a result of Deng Xiaoping allowing these experiments to go forward. That has never been a prevailing official view. And even among academia in the United States, that's not really the prevailing view. The problem now is that they so believe in their own narrative that it is really the state-owned enterprise, banking system and commanding heights. It's really those things that created the miracle. So they don't really believe. It's not because Xi Jinping calculated, oh, there's going to be an economic cost to cracking down the private sector. He actually, I think, believed there's no economic cost because the economic miracle was not created by these guys in the first place, right? So ideologically, that has never been accepted as the true reason why Chinese growth happened. That's not just true of Xi Jinping. It's true of all his previous leaders, I would say after 1989, after the 1989 crackdown. If you look at the people who basically control China from 1989 to 2002, and one can make an argument even until 2012, basically it's run by people from Shanghai. Let's look at Shanghai. Shanghai was the least reformed region in China in the 1980s. It had the lowest GDP growth rate among the Chinese regions. It had the highest share of the state-owned enterprises in production, in fixed asset investments, and yet it is the leaders from that region who basically define the economic agenda for the country since 1989. One thing I gave to them is the leaders from Shanghai had a global perspective, right? They wanted to open China to the outside world. They wanted to open Chinese universities to foreign universities. They wanted to open the country to foreign trade, to international capital. And that's a huge, huge plus. So I gave that to them. But at the same time, they also repressed rural China, rural entrepreneurship. The cost of that did not translate into GDP growth. The cost of that translated into crony capitalism, rising income inequality. Many people don't know this. In the 1980s, the Chinese income distribution improved. The Gini coefficient improved because rural China gained ahead of urban China. Since 1990, the income inequality has become worse. Crony capitalism has become worse. We have a database looking at the corruption cases in the 1980s, corruption cases in the 1990s. There's no comparison. The corruption cases in the 1990s skyrocketed as compared with the cases in 1980s. Anyway, so in summary, I think this is the problem. The intellectual narrative has never been that private sector drove Chinese economic growth. And this is true of Chinese officials, as well as true of many academics.
Thank you very much, Professor Huang, for kind of helping us to demystify the very methodical China model. I really wanted to pick up one thing that you talk about, the experimental approach. I think that's very similar to what we talk about nowadays, like policy and regulatory sandbox approach. So, that has been proven to be really useful and effective to conduct different policy experiments. And then it seems like China was doing that. And that's kind of one of the many factors that helped China to, create this, tremendous economic growth. And towards the end, you talk a little bit in the 90s that corruption has been and become a major part of like the Chinese economic and political system. So then I want to turn to David. Corruption has been really an enduring feature of the Chinese system, as we discussed. And some, describe China and Chinese system as crony capitalism, like Professor Huang, like yourself, and many others. So have you reported on Premier Wen Jiabao family's wealth? You really have very unique insight into this special relationship between the political elites, the Chinese Communist Party, and the private sector. So can you just to kind of break down the role of corruption in the system and the challenge it poses to China?
Sure. Actually, I think what Professor Huang said was a great lead into this, because China has this China model, and this China structure is so fascinating, partly because there is the state control part of the Chinese development model. And then there's the private entrepreneurs. And as he said, it's really the private entrepreneurs that were allowed, given the room, to build these great companies, even though they're kind of outside of this state model. So you have two different systems: the state system, which a lot of people believe is the China model, but this private entrepreneurial system, which is really giving them access and licenses. But part of doing that, I think, allowing those private entrepreneurs also was tying them in with the state. So they were the state was kind of saying, and the government officials at different levels, we'll let you experiment. We'll let you create your company in the areas that are not so state dominated. And there will be, you will send some kickbacks to me, or you will take care of my relatives or my friends. So there was this a relationship network that built up. The great private entrepreneurs were allowed to kind of, experiment in the system, but often they were a little, maybe quietly trapped. I would say trapped in a way that the price you will pay for being allowed to experiment is you're going to be expected to not to sort of link up with lots of officials and their families and their networks, so that we can also benefit. And I would love to hear what Professor Huang has to say about that, because it's this interesting dynamic that develops really starting, I would say, in a big way in the 90s, and then also going really crazy in the 2000s. And so what I saw on the ground is that was the price. It's almost like there was a tax on every private entrepreneur, but we'll give you access to land, we'll give you access to, we'll let you get foreign investment, we'll let you do all of these things, but we're going to have you kind of linked up to us in some way. And if anything, of course, happens to one of the officials, you could be taken down. There are great risks. And forcing all of the private entrepreneurs to buy into that system, to buy into, you will be a party member, you will be linked to the party officially and unofficially, officially through the state or through the licenses, unofficially through my family network. And so many leading entrepreneurs, I would say even very good people, felt this, I have to do this. There's no way around this. And so that created this amazing system where both, you can say, the Chinese government said, okay, I'm going to allow you to flourish. And they did. They flourished and they created amazing companies. But I'm also going to make sure that we profit from this privately. And it's also going to put you at great risk. And I think that's what we're seeing in the last, particularly after Xi Jinping came into office, is he's not only gone after just private entrepreneurs for, maybe there's some political threat, but he's got all the evidence he would want is to say, well, I can choose any private entrepreneur I want to take down, because all of them have probably had to do something to get a license to be close to an official in a different department. And so they're all vulnerable. And if I need anything from any of them, I can find something to threaten them with. And so that's why I was talking about earlier, they are trapped in so many ways, between the US and China, between China and itself, between the families. When the family of an official comes to me, is the official okaying that I do that? Are they setting me up? Am I at risk? Should I diversify and deal with lots of different families at different levels of government? Well, to me, that was the price you paid, or the risk that you took to be a great entrepreneur. And I find it very unlikely that anyone would be able to fully flourish in China without agreeing to some level to do that. And slowly over time, they saw that, suppose I chose the wrong person. Suppose that person is taken down. And as we know, Xi Jinping's crackdown starting in 2013 is the most fierce crackdown we've ever seen on corruption. But I would argue it wasn't really about corruption, although it was partly about corruption. That he may really have wanted to clean up the system. It was out of control, but also it was an effort, or it seems to be a way to tighten the political controls, which is what we know he was doing all through that period. And to put pressure on so many entrepreneurs. Like, all I have to do is arrest a couple of them. We bring back a Xiao Jianhuan, any entrepreneur is at risk. So that, I think, corruption is tightly wound into this system. And it both freed up the entrepreneurs to do great things, and it trapped them for a command and control leadership that could hold that over them and say, aha, you were corrupt, with the former officials or were with people who were not, or who are not close to the leadership today. And so that is, when that history is written of China's development, it's going to be a fascinating story if we can really get the details about how it both flourished, and you saw all the best of China, the best Chinese ideas, the best Chinese people, the best entrepreneurs rising to the top, but also in a system that kind of handcuffed them or shackled them to some degree, that made them very vulnerable and made them very nervous about like any misstep. And I can be taken down, and my whole family and our whole company can be taken down overnight. So the last couple of years, you've seen that. You've seen so many companies just shaken up. You have to make donations, or you have to join the party and use party speak, or don't go abroad and say anything. And I think Jack Ma is the symbol of that. I mean, I think one of the greatest entrepreneurs ever. I mean, if you just read, here's a guy, an English teacher, gets into the technology field, convinces Goldman Sachs foreign investors to bet on his company, first in Shanghai, then in Hangzhou, and creates this phenomenal company. But in the end, today, he's apparently painting. I mean, this is one of the greatest, models for China of entrepreneurship, and he can't even come out publicly. He's literally like painting every day at his home, maybe under some form of house detention or stay home, maybe not officially house detention, but we don't want to see you. That is incredible that has happened. And it is certainly making us rethink, like, where is China going? If this is, we've seen it go, they've opened up, they allowed entrepreneurs to flourish, but also with ties to the state. And now a lot of that is unraveling for many different reasons.
I think, David, you painted a very good picture of like the entrepreneurs who really are in like a rock, in between a rock and a hard place. Like it's just a very difficult position for them to be in. But you also asked a great question, like where does this lead to? So I would like to encourage the audience to post your questions in the chat box, and then I'm going to ask the question to both of you. And a lot of people are kind of asking the same question, like, is the reform, structural reform that China is very much needed, is that going to like start again? Is that even possible now under the current kind of challenging environment? So I will ask Professor Huang to kind of share your thoughts first, and then David, and if there's any question from the audience, please feel free to raise them.
Yeah, under the current politics, I just don't see any prospects for the kind of structural reforms that many of us are thinking about. Even before Xi Jinping, a lot of these structural reforms were not really carried out and implemented, right? The financial reforms, the land reforms, the household registration reforms. I mean, if you are truly are about common prosperity, there are lots of things you can do, right? One of them is to abolish the rural household registration system rather than kind of putting a gun on private entrepreneurs and forcing them to transfer their wealth. I mean, let's just say transfer all the wealth from Jack Ma and from Pony Ma to the Chinese rural population. That may make a difference for a day, but it's not going to make a difference in a real economic sense. I think David is absolutely right, and he portrays the Chinese business scene extremely accurately, which is the way you summarize it, right? Between a hard place and the rock. The difference that I would describe between Xi Jinping and his predecessors is that David is going to interview Desmond Shum, his book Red Roulette. The difference that I would describe is Desmond Shum was describing the Hu Jintao Wen Jiabao era, that's before 2012, as a red roulette, right? What does roulette mean? Roulette means that a gun has 6 chambers and one of them is loaded. The analogy that I have for the current period is that every single one of these chambers is loaded with a bullet, right? So the underlying dynamics are exactly the same. All these guys, because they needed financing, they needed a piece of land, maybe they needed a permission to make investments abroad. All these have been tightly controlled by the state. And the only way for them to get these things is through crony capitalism. So they accumulated a lot of this baggage in their closet. But in the past, 1 out of 6, right? So one chamber out of the 6 chambers is loaded. I'm willing to take that risk. The issue now is that if 5 of them are loaded with a bullet, are you still willing to take that risk, right? So that's the question that every private entrepreneur has to ask himself or herself now. 10 years ago, when I gave a lecture about kind of protection of property rights, and private entrepreneurs, every one of them said, Professor Huang, you're absolutely right. We understand you, but you're too abstract. We have these coping methods, and we have our own ways to get ourselves the protection. The way they got the protection is through bribing the government officials, right? And they didn't see institutional reforms as a necessary condition for their own business success because they have these individual solutions. The question now is, if these crackdowns really delivered a mortal blow to the Chinese economy, whether or not there's going to be a fundamental rethinking about the wisdom of a strong leader vis-a-vis the wisdom of having decent, normal institutions, right? Increasingly, we do hear from private entrepreneurs. What they said is, oh, the credit expansion, the credit support, I don't need that. What I need is rule of law, right? So then I don't have to be in that place between the hard rock and the hard place. I don't need to be there. I think if the future politics allows, I actually see this as potentially a pivotal moment toward a more deeper thinking about the direction of the reform, as opposed to, as long as we have a good leader, as long as we have a smart leader and wise leader, then we're okay, right? So I hope China is going to move in that direction.
Yeah, I can just add, Kathy, a little, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And one of the central things that Professor Huang talked about, I think, is the idea of trust, right? So the leadership now doesn't seem to actually have trust in its entrepreneurs. That's almost like going back to this earlier period and saying, we're a little worried about this capitalism. We don't really trust our private entrepreneurs. But eventually they said, okay, let's allow them a little more, give them a little room, take a few kickbacks and tie up. And then somehow under Xi Jinping, I would say really, it was never complete trust, but the trust started to erode dramatically. That who knows, are these the new oligarchs? Are they too powerful? Are they actually interfering in politics? Are they doing things? Do they have power bases? So in a way, as I was saying earlier, the trap is, first you ask me to pay the government official and his family, but then you accuse me of actually working with your enemies because you're in another faction or this is your opponent in the fight. So I don't really see how the entrepreneurs can get out of that trap. I also think the erosion of that trust, even in their own entrepreneurs, they're saying, we're not so sure the Chinese entrepreneurs are really with us, and so we're going to clamp down on them. And if they don't have that trust, if there's not that freedom to innovate and take risks, it's going to do significant damage, if it hasn't already begun to the whole innovation economy and developing new companies and putting money in. And also the foreign investors are going to think twice about, do I really want to be involved? Could they seize the companies? If they've done this to Jack Ma, are they going to seize my company if I invest? So I don't see a way out of this, at least as long as Xi Jinping rules the country with like command and control, and also believing that the China model, or the state leads the way, is the best way, and they're incredibly confident in this way. So, and they've got so much room to maneuver because they had an economy that was just exploding with growth. So they probably thought, we'll do these crackdowns and it'll lop a few percentage points off of the economy, but we're still super strong, and it's built up the confidence in China, almost like it's accidental, right? We didn't really know that the private entrepreneurs would be the one that take off. We thought it was the state leading the economy. It was actually them. But now we have room to sort of, control and contain them, and to restructure the economy, because they went out of control and they were corrupt. But that risks smothering the whole experiment, which was this interesting mixture of state and infrastructure and development with private entrepreneurs. China's so big that it can have all of these different things, or maybe really what should be said is the China model, right? It is the driving force has been, as Professor Huang said, the private entrepreneurs, but you had the state allowing things, allowing foreign capital in, investing in infrastructure, figuring out how to gain and trade, etc. But I think it's all a question now of, is the model going to completely change, or is this just for a period of Xi Jinping? We're just going to clamp down on all the private entrepreneurs and get the message that the state leads and the private entrepreneurs should be building toward serving the state. That's a very different kind of model, right? Is you're now going to somehow, maybe you serve your company, but you're really going to serve the state. And so a lot of these interventions with private companies will make lots of people inside China and outside China question, well, if I'm investing in a private company or developing one, could the state force us to make donations? Could they, decide that, we have to send all of our goods into China, or that we cannot deal with foreign capital, or we certainly listing overseas could be frowned upon, as it already is. So I don't really have an answer to what that's going to be, but it's gradually, we've seen a worsening, and it's not clear when that will slow down, or if it will end, or even if Xi Jinping leaves, that there will be this mindset that the new way of doing things is actually to not allow the private entrepreneurs to flourish that much, to turn, now that we're big enough, turn them into state entrepreneurs, turn all these companies into state companies, and they can all serve us, and they can do it'll be the mixed model. They'll be mostly state, and they'll do a little private.
This is such a fascinating discussion, and we're at like 3 minutes past the hour. I have been just, fascinated by the whole discussion. So once I heard someone describe China this way, a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. So after this thoughtful and insightful discussion today, I feel like we all make a very small progress towards to understanding China slightly better. And I personally have been watching China closely on the ground and from afar for the past 15 years. And it's just mesmerizing country, always has tons of things happening at the same time. And one thing I've found is like keeping an open mind is always the right thing to do, because a lot of things happening in China, they just are totally in contradiction with each other. And so like, you described today that the China model, is because of the diverse and experiments on the ground that made it possible. So I completely agree with that. And then one key takeaway for me from today is that I think we all need to be very clear-eyed about China today, because everything to the party, to the state, is about politics, and it's about its rule, it's about its regime, it's about its power base. So when we are talking about businesses, when we're talking about entrepreneurship, commercial relationship, trade, and even the private sector that we cover a lot today. So in the eyes of the ruling elites, it's all about whether this is helpful to them to consolidate their political power. I think that's kind of my key takeaway from today. And so I want to thank you very much. And I saw that Abdu said that, if we have a half day seminar, or maybe even a 2 full-day discussion about this topic, I think that would be fantastic. So we definitely will try to continue the conversation with both of you after the event. And thank you everyone for attending. So
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank